So Emma, I've been running this experiment on myself for the past few weeks. I wanted to finally get serious about improving my Spanish, and I kept waiting for that perfect moment when I'd feel motivated enough to start. Guess what? That moment never came.
That's because you're waiting for a sequence that doesn't exist in nature. The neuroscience is pretty clear on this. Motivation doesn't precede action. It's actually the reverse. And understanding that inversion changes everything about how we approach skill development.
Which is exactly what we're diving into today. We're looking at language learning, but really, this is about the gap between knowing what to do and actually doing it. And I'm talking about systems that work whether you're learning English, building a new habit, or trying to master any skill.
Right. And we're not doing the usual just be more disciplined advice. We're going to break down the actual psychology of why people get stuck, then give you concrete protocols you can test this week. We'll look at how tiny improvements compound over time, why perfectionism is secretly sabotaging your progress, and a specific technique that feels almost too simple to work, but the research behind it is solid.
I've personally tested everything we're covering today. Some of it felt ridiculous at first, honestly, but the results speak for themselves. And the beauty is that these systems remove the need for willpower or motivation entirely.
We're going to show you how to make consistency inevitable rather than optional. So if you've ever felt stuck in that loop of wanting to improve but never quite starting, or starting and stopping repeatedly, this episode is basically a blueprint for breaking that cycle.
Why waiting for motivation is actually costing you more than you think.
All right, let's talk about something I see constantly, and honestly, something I've fallen into myself more times than I'd like to admit. The "I'll start when I feel ready" trap. You know what I mean, right? I'll launch that side project when I have more energy. I'll start working out next month when things calm down. It's this pervasive belief that there's going to be some magical moment when everything aligns and you'll just feel motivated.
Oh, I know this one intimately. And here's the thing that blew my mind when I first encountered the research on this. We have the entire sequence backwards. We think motivation comes first, then action follows. But the data shows it's actually the reverse. Action creates motivation, not the other way around.
Wait, break that down for me, because that feels counterintuitive. Like, don't I need to feel energized to go to the gym?
That's the myth. Think about it this way. How many times have you dragged yourself to the gym feeling completely unmotivated, but then halfway through your workout, you're actually enjoying it? Or you sit down to write when you don't feel like it, and suddenly you're in flow state. The act of starting is what generates the feeling we mistakenly wait for.
Okay, so let's quantify the cost here, because I'm all about understanding what we're actually losing when we fall into this pattern. What's the real price of waiting for the perfect time?
Well, there's the obvious opportunity cost. Every day you delay starting that business or exercise routine is a day of potential progress lost. But there's also a psychological cost that's less visible but arguably more damaging. The research identifies several barriers: fear of failure, negative self-talk, and this false belief that a perfect time exists. For starting businesses, for relationships, for fitness goals, we're waiting for a moment that literally doesn't exist.
And here's what I've noticed in my own experiments. The "I'll start tomorrow" loop is incredibly expensive from a mental energy standpoint. It's not like you're just neutral while you're waiting. You're actively carrying that incomplete task around in your head.
Yes, this is where the Zeigarnik effect comes in, and it's fascinating. This was documented way back in 1927, and it shows that our brains actually prioritize incomplete tasks. They create these persistent mental loops that demand resolution. So when you keep telling yourself, "I'll start my business next month," or "I'll begin that course when I have more time," your brain is constantly running that loop in the background.
It's like having 20 browser tabs open, each one draining your battery. I've tested this personally. I tracked my mental clarity on days when I had unstarted projects hanging over me versus days when I'd at least taken the first step on something. The difference was measurable. Just starting, even badly, closed that loop.
And the data backs up how common this is. Research suggests that about 20.
All right, I want to talk about something that completely changed how I approach optimization. It's this idea that you don't need massive overhauls, you just need to get 1% better every single day.
The compounding gains model. I love this because the math is so counterintuitive. Most people think 1% is nothing, right? Like, who cares about improving by 1%? But when you actually run the numbers, it's wild.
Okay, so walk me through the actual calculation, because I know the result sounds impressive, but I want to understand the mechanism.
Sure. So if you improve by 1% every single day for a year,
You're essentially multiplying 1.01 by itself 365 times. That's 1.01 to the power of 365. And when you calculate that out, you end up 37.78 times better than when you started.
Wait, 37 times better from just 1% daily improvements?
Precisely. That's the power of compounding. It's the same principle that makes compound interest so powerful in finance, but applied to skills, habits, systems, anything you're trying to optimize. But here's where I get skeptical.
How do you even measure a 1% improvement in something like language learning or productivity? It's not like there's a meter that tells you you're exactly 1% better today.
That's a fair pushback. I think the 1% is more of a mental model than a precise measurement. What it really means is, what's the smallest, meaningful improvement I can make today? It's about the philosophy of marginal gains. This idea that if you improve by just a tiny bit in multiple areas, the aggregate effect is massive.
Right, the aggregation of marginal gains. British Cycling used this approach, didn't they? They optimized everything from the bike seats to the pillows the athletes slept on.
Correct. They didn't look for one big breakthrough. They looked for hundreds of tiny improvements. And the cumulative effect was they went from mediocre to dominating the Olympics and Tour de France.
So I actually tested this with my Vietnamese learning. Instead of trying to overhaul my entire study routine, I asked, what's one small thing I can improve today? Maybe it's learning 5 new words instead of 0, or spending 2 minutes on pronunciation instead of skipping it entirely.
And what happened? Did you actually see compounding results?
Here's what was interesting. The first week, it felt like nothing was happening. Like I'm learning 5 words a day, big deal. But by week 3, I had this vocabulary base that made everything else easier. New words started sticking faster because I had context. Listening comprehension improved because I recognized more words. It genuinely felt like the gains were accelerating.
That's the compounding effect in action. The early gains feel invisible, but they're building the foundation for exponential growth later. It's like the first few months of investing. You're not seeing huge returns yet, but you're building the principle that will compound.
But I also noticed something important. The 1% improvement only compounds if you're consistent. If I skipped 3 days, I didn't just lose 3 days of progress, I lost the momentum. The compounding broke.
That's the flip side of the equation. Just like 1.01 to the 365th power makes you 37 times better, 0.99 to the 365th power, getting 1% worse each day, leaves you at nearly 0. You decline to 0.03 of where you started.
Wow. So consistency isn't just important, it's the entire mechanism. The compounding only works if you show up every day.
Correct. And this is why I think the 1% framework is so powerful for optimization. It removes the pressure of perfection. You don't need to have a perfect study session. You don't need to overhaul your entire life. You just need to be slightly better than yesterday. So let's make this practical. If someone's listening and thinking, okay, I want to apply this to my own learning or productivity, what's the actual implementation strategy? First, pick one specific area you want to optimize. Don't try to improve everything at once. That's a recipe for burnout. Maybe it's language learning, maybe it's your morning routine, maybe it's your writing process. Just one thing. And then what? How do you identify the 1% improvement? What's the smallest change I could make today that would move me forward? And I mean smallest. Not I'm going to study for 3 hours. That's not sustainable. More like I'm going to review my flashcards for 5 minutes, or I'm going to write 1 sentence in my target language. So it's about lowering the barrier to entry so much that you can't talk yourself out of it. Then you track it. You need some way to measure whether you're actually showing up every day. It doesn't have to be fancy. A simple check mark on a calendar works. But you need that visual feedback loop. I used a habit tracker app for this. Every day I did my 5 minutes of Vietnamese, I marked it complete. And seeing that streak build up became its own motivation. I didn't want to break the chain. That's the psychological hack. The streak becomes more valuable than the individual day's effort. You're not just learning Vietnamese, you're maintaining your identity as someone who shows up consistently. But let's talk about the plateau problem, because I did hit a point where it felt like the 1% gain stopped compounding, like I was just maintaining, not improving. That's actually normal. Compounding isn't perfectly linear. You'll have periods of rapid growth and periods where it feels like nothing's happening. The question is, are you still making the 1% effort even when you can't see the results? And that's where most people quit, right? They stop seeing immediate progress, so they assume the system isn't working. Precisely. But if you look at the math, the biggest gains happen in the later stages of compounding. The first 100 days of 1% improvement only gets you to about 2.7 times better. But days 200 to 300, that's where you go from 7 times better to 19 times better.
The curve is exponential. So the people who stick with it through the plateau are the ones who actually see the massive returns. Correct. And this is why I think the 1% framework is more sustainable than the go big or go home approach. Because when you're only trying to improve by 1%, you can do it even on your worst days. You can do it when you're tired, when you're busy, when you're not feeling motivated. It's optimization through consistency, not intensity. Precisely. And over time, those tiny, consistent efforts compound into results that look like overnight success to everyone else. But you know it was just 1% every day for a year. All right, so here's my challenge to anyone listening. Pick one thing you want to optimize, just one. And for the next 30 days, ask yourself every single day, what's my 1% improvement today? Track it, show up, and see what compounds. And if you want to take it further, think about the aggregation of marginal gains. What are all the tiny variables in your system? Maybe it's not just studying more. Maybe it's also optimizing your sleep so you retain information better, or changing your environment so you have fewer distractions. Each small optimization stacks, because here's the thing about compounding. It doesn't just apply to one variable. If you're improving multiple areas by 1% each, the combined effect is even more powerful. Right, and that's where the real optimization happens. Not in finding the one perfect hack, but in systematically improving every small piece of the puzzle. Now, understanding compounding is one thing, but there's a specific barrier that stops most people from even getting to day 2.
All right, so we've established that waiting for motivation is a trap. But here's the practical problem everyone faces. You're sitting there, you know you should practice English, and your brain is screaming, "I don't feel like it." What's the actual protocol to override that resistance?
This is where the psychology gets really interesting. There's a CBT technique called the 5-minute rule that specifically targets what researchers call activation energy. Basically, the emotional barrier that makes starting feel impossible. The protocol is dead simple. You commit to just 5 minutes. Not an hour, not even 20 minutes, just 5.
I've tested this extensively, and what fascinates me is how consistently it works. The trick isn't that 5 minutes is enough to learn English. It's that 5 minutes is short enough that your brain can't justify resisting it. You're essentially hacking the resistance mechanism.
Right, and here's what the research shows. When people start with just 5 minutes of English study, they consistently report feeling proud afterward and wanting to continue. The action itself creates the motivation, not the other way around. You're triggering a dopamine-driven success loop.
Let me break down what this looks like in practice. Say it's 7 p.m., you're tired, you've been telling yourself all day you'll practice English, and now you're on the couch scrolling your phone. The traditional approach is to guilt yourself into a full study session. The optimized approach, tell yourself, I'm going to do exactly 5 minutes, then I can stop.
And what happens in those 5 minutes matters. You're not just staring at a textbook. A concrete example from the research, you listen to a short podcast segment and learn 3 new words. That's it. 3 words in 5 minutes. But you've completed something. You've made measurable progress, and your brain registers that as a win.
Here's where it gets interesting, the transition phase. What I've found through personal testing is that about 70% of the time when the 5 minutes are up, you keep going. Not because you forced yourself, but because you're already in motion. The activation energy has been spent. You're past the hard part. That's the mechanism at work.
The 5 minutes aren't the goal. They're the entry point. Once you're engaged, the resistance drops dramatically. Suddenly 10 minutes feels doable, then 15. The research shows that even 10 minutes of focused practice can serve as a catalyst for real progress.
But we need to be precise about the implementation here. The rule only works if you genuinely give yourself permission to stop after 5 minutes. If you're secretly planning to do 30 minutes and just lying to yourself, your brain sees through it and the resistance stays high. The commitment has to be authentic. That's a crucial point. You're not tricking yourself. You're lowering the barrier legitimately. Some days you'll do 5 minutes and stop. That's fine. You still practiced. You still maintain the habit. But most days you'll naturally extend because the hardest part was just starting. I've also found that the 5-minute protocol works best when you have a specific pre-planned activity. Not, I'll study English for 5 minutes, but I'll listen to this specific podcast episode and write down 3 new words. The more concrete the task, the lower the activation energy.
And this is where micro-sessions become powerful. Instead of thinking, I need to find an hour to study, you start seeing 5-minute opportunities everywhere. Waiting for coffee to brew, 5-minute session. On the train, 5-minute session. Before bed, 5-minute session. The cumulative effect is massive. What's the minimum effective dose here? If someone only ever did 5-minute sessions, would that actually work? Honestly, yes, but with a caveat. 5 minutes daily is infinitely better than 0 minutes daily. You're building the habit, maintaining exposure, and making incremental progress. But the real power is that those 5-minute sessions naturally expand. The research shows that once you're in motion, 10 minutes of focused practice can change everything. Commit to 5 minutes, make it concrete and specific, give yourself genuine permission to stop, and let the natural momentum carry you forward when it happens. The goal isn't to trick yourself into longer sessions, it's to eliminate the barrier to starting in the first place. Precisely. And here's what makes this sustainable. You're not relying on willpower or motivation. You're designing a system where starting is so easy that resistance can't build up. That's the difference between a strategy that works for a week and one that works for years. But there's something even more fundamental happening here that most people miss. When you consistently start with 5 minutes, you're not just learning English, you're rewiring your relationship with action itself. Which raises an interesting question. What if the real skill we're building isn't language proficiency, but the ability to start things without needing to feel ready first?
Okay, so we've talked about starting small and building momentum. But here's where most people actually get stuck, and I mean completely paralyzed. It's not that they don't start, it's that they're terrified of doing it wrong.
The perfectionism trap. I see this constantly in my own experiments. People would rather do nothing than do something imperfectly. And the irony, that's literally the opposite of how learning works at a neurological level.
Right. So let's break this down systematically. What's actually happening when someone makes a mistake while learning? Because I think most people treat errors like they're, evidence of failure rather than data points.
That's the reframe we need. Think about how children learn to walk. They fall, constantly, like hundreds of times. And nobody looks at a toddler who's fallen for the 50th time and thinks, well, this kid just doesn't have what it takes to walk. That would be absurd.
But we do that to ourselves as adults all the time.
Every single day. And here's what's fascinating. Mistakes aren't just normal, they're actually the mechanism of learning. When a child falls, their brain is getting incredibly precise feedback about balance, weight distribution, muscle coordination. Each fall is literally teaching their nervous system what doesn't work, which narrows down what does.
So the mistake is the lesson, not a sign you should quit, but the actual information your brain needs to improve.
Precisely. And this isn't just a nice metaphor. There's actual neuroscience here. Carol Dweck's research at Stanford has shown that people with what she calls a growth mindset engage with errors completely differently at a neurological level compared to people with a fixed mindset.
Okay, break down those terms for me. Growth mindset versus fixed mindset.
So a fixed mindset is the belief that your abilities are basically static. You're either smart or you're not. You're either good at math or you're not. Talented at languages or you're not. It's this idea that intelligence and skill are fixed traits you're born with.
Which means when you make a mistake, it's revealing something fundamental about your limitations.
Correct. It's threatening. A growth mindset, on the other hand, sees abilities as things you develop through effort and learning. You're not bad at Spanish, you just haven't learned Spanish yet. The mistake isn't revealing your limits, it's showing you where to focus next.
And you said there's actual brain activity differences?
Yes. Dweck's research shows that when people with a growth mindset make an error, their brains engage more deeply with it. They're processing the mistake, analyzing it, extracting the lesson. People with a fixed mindset, their brains basically shut down. They disengage because the error feels like a threat to their identity rather than useful information.
That's wild. So it's not just about attitude, it's literally changing how your brain processes feedback.
And the real-world results back this up. There was a growth mindset intervention study with students that showed increases in GPA and advanced course enrollment, specifically because it countered the belief that mistakes indicate a lack of ability. When students stopped seeing errors as proof they weren't smart enough, they actually engaged more with challenging material.
Okay, so here's where I want to get practical. Because I think most people hearing this would say, sure, growth mindset sounds great, but how do I actually shift from seeing mistakes as failures to seeing them as data? It's not like you can just flip a switch.
No, but you can build systems that reinforce the new perspective. What did you do?
So I ran this experiment I called my failure log. And I know that sounds dramatic, but hear me out. Every day for 3 months, I documented one thing I did wrong or poorly. Not in a self-flagellating way. Very specifically, I wrote down what I tried, what went wrong, and what I learned from it.
I love this. You're literally training yourself to extract value from mistakes.
Precisely. And what happened was fascinating. In the first few weeks, it was actually hard to find things to write down because I was unconsciously avoiding situations where I might fail. I was playing it safe without even realizing it.
The perfectionism tax in action.
Right, but once I committed to logging one failure per day, I started taking more risks.
I'd try speaking Spanish with native speakers, even though I'd mess up. I'd attempt a new recipe without following the instructions perfectly. I'd pitch ideas in meetings that weren't fully formed, because I needed material for my log.
So the system gamified making mistakes.
Completely. And here's what I noticed after about 6 weeks. When I looked back at my early entries, the mistakes I'd been so worried about seemed trivial. Like, I had this entry about mispronouncing a word in Spanish and feeling embarrassed. 2 months later, I'm having full conversations with errors all over the place and not even thinking about it.
Because you'd normalized the error-making process. It stopped being this big emotional event and became just information.
Precisely. And the learning curve was noticeably steeper. I was iterating faster because I wasn't spending 3 days researching the perfect way to do something before trying it. I just try it, see what broke, adjust, and try again.
This is the optimization insight people miss. They think perfectionism is about high standards, but it's actually incredibly inefficient. You're spending enormous amounts of time and mental energy trying to avoid mistakes that would actually teach you faster than all that preparation.
The perfectionism tax. You're paying in time, in stress, in opportunities not taken, and you're not even getting better results. You're just getting slower results.
And here's the thing. This applies to everything. Learning a language, starting a business, getting fit, learning to code. The people who improve fastest aren't the ones who avoid mistakes. They're the ones who make mistakes quickly, extract the lesson, and move on. So if someone wants to start applying this, what's the minimum effective dose? Not everyone's going to keep a failure log for 3 months. Start with 1 deliberate mistake per week. And I mean deliberate. Choose something you've been avoiding because you might not do it perfectly and just do it badly. Try the recipe without measuring. Have the conversation in your target language even though you'll stumble. Submit the draft that's not quite polished. And actually pay attention to what happens. Because I think what you'll find is that the consequences of imperfect action are way less severe than the cost of perfect inaction. Right. The toddler learning to walk doesn't wait until they've studied biomechanics and developed perfect balance. They just fall. A lot. And then one day, they're walking. Which brings us to something I've been testing that takes this even further. Because it's one thing to accept mistakes when you're learning. But what about when you're trying to build a consistent habit? That's where most people's systems completely fall apart.
All right, so we've talked about taking action, but here's where it gets tactical. There's this technique called shadowing that I've been testing for the past 3 months, and it's honestly one of the most underrated fluency hacks I've found. Emma, you want to break down what shadowing actually is?
Sure. So shadowing is deceptively simple. You listen to spoken English and immediately repeat it aloud, trying to match the speaker's intonation, stress, and rhythm in real time. You're basically becoming their echo. But here's what makes it powerful. You're not pausing to think about grammar or vocabulary. You're training your mouth and ears to work together automatically.
Right, and that's the key difference from traditional listen and repeat exercises. With shadowing, there's no pause button. You're doing it simultaneously, which forces your brain into a different mode. I started with just 30-second clips from podcasts, and honestly, the first week was brutal. I sounded like a broken robot.
That's actually expected. Your brain is building new neural pathways. There's fascinating research here from Cadota in 2012 that found shadowing specifically boosts what's called phonological encoding, basically how your brain processes and produces sounds. It keeps something called the phonological loop in your working memory constantly active.
Okay, hold on. Phonological loop? That sounds very academic. What does that actually mean for someone trying to speak better English?
Fair question. Think of your working memory as having different components. The phonological loop is the part that handles sound-based information. It's like a mental rehearsal space for language. When you shadow, you're forcing this loop to stay engaged. You're hearing sounds, holding them briefly in memory, and reproducing them almost instantly. It's like doing reps at the gym, but for your language processing system. So it's not just about pronunciation, you're actually training the underlying system that processes spoken language. Correct. And here's where it gets interesting. A study at National Taiwan University showed that shadowing significantly improves students' intonation, fluency, and overall pronunciation accuracy. But what I find most compelling is that it helps proceduralize language. That's the technical term for turning conscious knowledge into automatic output. You know how you don't think about where each finger goes when you type? That's proceduralized knowledge. Shadowing does the same thing for speaking.
That's the holy grail, right? Moving from I know the words to the words just come out naturally. So let me share my actual system for this because I've tested a bunch of variations. First, you need the right source material. I use EnglishEasyPractice.com. They have these graded audio clips specifically designed for shadowing, ranging from slow, clear speech to native speed conversations.
What makes those better than just using, say, YouTube videos or Netflix?
Length and clarity. Their clips are 30 seconds to 2 minutes max, which is the sweet spot for focus practice, and they're recorded with clear audio and natural pacing, not too slow, not too fast. When I tried shadowing random YouTube videos, I'd get derailed by background noise, music, or speakers who mumbled. You want clean input, especially when you're starting.
That makes sense. You're trying to build a clean mental model of the sounds. Garbage in, garbage out.
Precisely. So here's my step-by-step protocol. Step 1, listen to the clip once without shadowing. Just absorb it. Notice the rhythm, where the stress falls, how sentences flow together. Step 2, shadow the clip 3 times in a row. Don't stop between repetitions. Just hit replay and go again. Your goal isn't perfection. It's to keep your mouth moving and matching the rhythm. I love that you emphasize rhythm over perfection. A lot of learners get stuck trying to pronounce every single word perfectly and miss the bigger picture of how English actually flows. Focus on one specific element. Maybe it's the intonation pattern, how the voice rises and falls, or maybe it's linking sounds between words. Pick one thing to pay extra attention to during your next 3 repetitions. This is where the real learning happens because you're not just mindlessly repeating, you're actively noticing patterns. That's deliberate practice. You're isolating variables and working on them systematically. What about recording yourself? I know some people swear by that. I tested that for a month. Here's my take. Recording is useful once a week to check progress, but not during every session. If you're constantly stopping to listen back, you break the flow state that makes shadowing effective. The magic is in the continuous repetition, not in self-analysis. Save the recording for Friday, compare it to the original, note what's improved, and move on. That's a really practical distinction. So what's the minimum effective dose here? How much shadowing do you actually need to see results? I found 10 minutes a day is the floor. That's 2 clips, 3 repetitions each with focused attention. But here's the thing, it has to be daily. Shadowing 3 times a week for 30 minutes doesn't work as well as 10 minutes every single day. Your phonological loop needs consistent activation to build those automatic pathways. That aligns with what we know about motor learning and skill acquisition. Distributed practice beats massed practice almost every time. Your brain needs time between sessions to consolidate what it's learned. Precisely. And here's a mistake I made early on. I tried to shadow content that was too difficult. I was using TED Talks with complex vocabulary and fast speakers. Big mistake. You want material that's maybe 10 to 20% above your current level, challenging enough to stretch you, but not so hard that you're just stumbling through it. That's the zone of proximal development. Too easy and you're not learning. Too hard and you're just frustrated. What about accent? Should people try to shadow a specific accent like British or American? Honestly, pick one and stick with it for at least 3 months. I chose standard American English because that's what most of my work calls for. But the key is consistency. If you're shadowing British English one day and Australian the next, you're confusing your phonological loop. It's like trying to learn 2 different instruments at once. Don't worry about losing your accent or sounding like a native speaker. The goal of shadowing is fluency and intelligibility, not impersonation. You're training your brain to process and produce English more automatically, not to erase your identity. Well said. And here's something I noticed around week 6. I started catching myself using the intonation patterns I'd been shadowing in my actual conversations. Like I wasn't consciously thinking about it, it just started happening. That's when I knew the technique was working. The declarative knowledge was becoming procedural. That's the transfer effect. You're not just memorizing phrases, you're internalizing the underlying patterns of how English sounds and flows. And once those patterns are automatic, you can apply them to any content, not just what you've practiced. Use clean, graded audio from something like EnglishEasyPractice.com. Start with 1 listen through, then 3 immediate repetitions. Focus on rhythm and flow over perfect pronunciation. Pick one specific element to improve each session. 10 minutes daily, same accent, material that's slightly challenging but not overwhelming. Record yourself once a week to track progress, but don't let it interrupt your flow during practice. And remember, the first week will feel awkward. Your mouth will trip over sounds, you'll fall behind the speaker, and you'll probably feel a bit silly. That's all normal. You're building new neural pathways. Give it 2 weeks of consistent practice before you judge whether it's working. Yeah, and here's the thing. Shadowing isn't glamorous. It's not a hack that gives you instant results. But it's one of those techniques where the compound effect is real. After a month, you'll notice your rhythm is better. After 3 months, you'll catch yourself using natural intonation without thinking. After 6 months, people will start commenting that your English sounds more fluent. It's the difference between knowing about language and embodying it. Shadowing bridges that gap by engaging your motor system, your auditory system, and your working memory all at once. It's whole brain practice. So if you take one thing from this segment, start shadowing today. Not tomorrow, not next week, today. Pick one 30-second clip, shadow it 3 times, and see how it feels. That's your experiment. Because here's what I've learned from testing hundreds of techniques. The ones that work are usually simple, unsexy, and require consistent repetition. Shadowing checks all 3 boxes. And if shadowing is about building fluency through repetition, there's another layer we need to talk about. How to actually retain what you're learning so it sticks long term. Because fluency without retention is just temporary performance. So here's what I keep coming back to. We started this conversation talking about motivation, and we're ending it with shadowing protocols. But the through line is actually the same. You can't think your way into fluency. You have to act your way there.
Right, and that's the optimization mindset in a nutshell. It's not about finding the perfect system or waiting until you feel ready. It's about understanding the mechanisms. Action creates motivation, consistency compounds, mistakes are data, and then just starting. Even badly.
Especially badly, honestly. I've tested enough of these frameworks now to know that my best learning periods always came right after I was willing to sound ridiculous. The perfectionism tax is real, and it's expensive.
So if someone's listening to this and thinking, okay, I get it, but what do I actually do tomorrow? What's your move?
5 minutes, that's it. Pick one clip, shadow it 3 times, and see what happens. Don't plan a whole curriculum. Don't wait until Monday. Just remove the barrier to starting and let the compounding take care of the rest.
And track it, even if it's just a check mark on your calendar. Because once you see that streak building, the system starts to run itself. You're not relying on motivation anymore. You're relying on momentum, which is way more reliable. Motivation is a feeling. Momentum is physics. I love that. All right, so here's to building systems that work even when we don't feel like it, and to getting 1% better at something today, even if it's messy, especially if it's messy. That's how you know you're actually learning. Thanks for geeking out on this with me, Emma, always. And to everyone listening, go be deliberately imperfect at something this week. We'll be back next time with more experiments, more frameworks, and probably more evidence that the boring